Hello, everybody. We are now in the middle of spring, coming up on our last first Monday at Jordan Hall of the season, May 5th. When I planned the whole season, I felt a real urge, as always, to celebrate great composers' birthdays. This year we've celebrated Charles Ives, we've celebrated Anton Bruckner, we've celebrated Bedřich Smetana. But the other thing that I found arising as a theme for the year was the form of piano trio. When I'm planning a season of these concerts, I'm always looking for something to tie things together. And what became obvious to me was that every concert was going to deal in some fashion with the form of piano trio. That's not three pianos, in case you don't know. It's a piano with a violin and a cello. And one common string during that, from the first concert to this one, May 5th, was that Brahms took that combination of piano, violin, and cello and wrote three great pieces for it. We had the first one in our October concert. The first one we presented was the C major. In March of this year, we presented the great B major, which was called Opus 8, but which he rewrote much later in his life. And the one that we're going to present tonight is what we call the third piano trio. It's in C minor. And I should interject by saying there are two other trios involving piano. So one was a late piece for piano, clarinet, and cello, Opus 114, and another one was Opus 40, an earlier one for piano, violin, and French horn. We didn't present those two this year, but we have over the years had them on the series. So we're now coming to a great example of late Brahms. What does that mean? It means that when you're young, you have models that you follow. One of the great models for him was Schubert, who wrote these beautiful, long, flowing melodies. And Opus 8 already, even when rewritten later on, has these beautiful, long melodies. And the same thing is true of the C major trio. By this time, Brahms, he was not extremely old, but he was beginning to say, not only with his greatly increased skills and technique as a composer, but as a person who'd lived enough life to say, I don't have to tell you a long story to give you my message. I can do it in more concise form. And this last trio has a mixture of those two. The history of it is actually very nice. Very often his pattern for writing music is he wrote a lot of music in the summertime. And then when the autumn came, he dealt with getting it performed. So what happened in the summer of 1886, so he was, by that time, he was 53 years old. He was still in good shape. And he had a very dear, close friend who lived in Switzerland. He was a poet and a pastor. His name was Joseph Victor Widmann. And Widmann lived in a very beautiful, on the edge of a very beautiful lake in the Bernese Oberland part of Switzerland called Thun, Thun, which in German means tuna. And there are two lakes right there. I've been in that area. I know how beautiful and wonderful it is, particularly in summertime. It's just kind of idyllic. And there are two lakes, and the little city right between the two lakes is known as Interlaken, which means between the two lakes. Anyway, he was staying with his friend Widmann in Thun. And by that time, I guess he was such a good composer and maybe just delighting in where he was that he, in short period of time that he was there, 2 or 3 months, he wrote 3 of his greatest masterpieces, all in chamber form. The first of them was, of course, I know it, I'm a cellist. It was his sonata in F major, opus 99. The second one was sonata for violin in A major, opus 100. And the last was this trio for taking those 2 instruments and throwing himself into it, the piano trio in C minor, opus 101. So his typical method was he would write these pieces, then he would go back to Vienna, where he was living by then, and start practicing, because Brahms was a formidable pianist. And if you know his 2 piano concertos, he could play his own piano concertos, and you can't not only do that, but if to know what to write to make that to work, you have to be very good. I mean, you get busy with some things and you don't do them all the time. So I would guess by that point, Brahms was not practicing the piano very much, but he was determined to bring all 3 of those pieces to life with himself playing. When he came back in 1884 to Vienna, he set to work practicing. And I think as he was probably practicing those pieces because he was going to play it. And he began to look at it, and maybe he fussed and he changed a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And then the first performances were all that fall. And Brahms was very interesting. He destroyed all his sketches of anything he was writing. He didn't want anybody to see his process of composing. And we have rare glimpses of that from the piano quintet and piece that went through a lot of different forms. But he would play it with fine people. So when he came to the piano trio, he had 2 great players to play. The cellist was David Popper, that all cellists knows as one of the greatest cellists of his time, who wrote a lot of music for it. And the violinist was Jenő, I think it's pronounced, Hubay, who was the Hungarian violinist. And they gave the first performance of it, I think, in the very end of that year. What Brahms would do then, based upon his practicing of hearing it in real time in the first performances, thinking about what he wanted, he would then modify it and prepare it for publication. So in early the next year, all 3 of those pieces in that order were published. And that was his system. So what is it about this piece? Well, first of all, it is adventurous and forward-looking. He starts in a very, very compact da yada da da yada da da yada da da, very, very, very agitated. And the melodies are not these long, beautiful, slow melodies. And it calms down, and it comes to a beautiful second theme played with the violin and the cello in unison. Something like that. And the whole piece is back and forth between those. So it's a standard sonata allegro movement with a fiery first theme and a melodious second theme. And yet the whole thing happens in a relatively short amount of time compared to his about to be revised B major trio. It's at least a third shorter. Now, what happens next is 2 movements that are just so unlike anything I know of that he's written before. He writes a scherzo movement that is soft and fleeting. It's like creatures very quiet and very, very and then it's gone. Expression I used to know as will o' the wisp. I think I'm saying that right. It was just like fireflies dancing. It was something just in nature, and then it was gone. That's the second movement. Then he comes to a movement which is slower, but maybe, well, it's on an ABA section. That means the first thing coming back at the end. He does something very unusual for a person of his time. People were writing in very standard bar lengths, 4 beats in a bar, 3 beats in a bar, 6/8, which is papa, something like that. And he writes a melody. 3/2, 3/2. And later in the trio, 6/8, 9/8. So alternating between these two things. And it's very tender, and yet asks a lot of questions. It's kind of, he's thinking about other things at this point in his life. It happens that way. I'm old, so I know that's part of aging. And then he comes to a last movement, which is just, again, huge energy, da-da-da-da, yet-da-da-da, that kind of stuff. And it ends, and the whole trio is the shortest trio he wrote, with great power and concentration. And so that piece begins our program tonight, and it is, simply stated, the completion of our series of trios this year. I know you'll love it. Please enjoy it. So now we come to the last piece of this program and the last piece of our season. It's a piece written in an unusual form. It's a concerto. You don't think of chamber works as being concertos. Concerto for violin, piano, and string quartet. I don't know of another in that form, but anyway, if there is, this is the famous one that it was inspired by. Our composer is a very, very interesting person. His name is Ernest Chausson. He was born in 1855, born into the family of a businessman who made a lot of money, and grew up really in the lap of luxury, as we say, where it was not sure where his life should go, and certainly he was not worried about where money would come from. But his father very much thought he should become a lawyer. And he was a good boy. I mean, he was obedient to his parents, and he actually went to law school and finished it, and I think began to practice law, but really, really didn't like it. But he'd done what he was told to do, and so he was searching, and everybody, I can imagine the parents saying, so what are you going to do with your life, Ernest? What are you going to do? Well, he was living in Paris, and he was living well in Paris, and so we'd say today he hung out with a lot of people in the artistic world, people who were not necessarily musicians, painters, writers. He tried everything. He tried writing. He tried drawing. I don't think he ever made an oil painting that I know about. But he was really searching for who he was. And somehow or other, music found him. My teacher years ago, Gregor Piatowski, says, you don't choose music, music chooses you. And it seems like that was what happened. So he enrolled at the Paris Conservatory, and he had 2 famous teachers. One was Jules Massenet, who was an old-fashioned composer, writer of operas, and very successful various kinds of pieces. And then he studied with the defining teacher of his life, César Franck. And Franck, I'll talk about this in a minute, was born in Belgium, but you think of him as a French composer. His name sort of sounds like Franck, French. And but he lived most of his life in Paris. And Franck, to just go sideways for a second, was interested in very dramatic music. He was very much interested in what he was learning from Liszt and Wagner about much more complicated harmony modulations, moving chromatically from key to key, and wrote chamber music, wrote music for organ, wrote symphony, and interestingly wrote a very great violin sonata that he dedicated and gave to his countryman Eugene Ysaÿe, if I say it correctly, who was the greatest Belgian violinist, and Franck was Belgian. And if you want to talk about, somebody who's getting married, to give them a nice present, César Franck wrote a violin sonata for Ysaÿe and his wife, about to be, and it was a wedding present. So there is a lot of link when we come to Chausson, having studied with Franck, in the relationship of Belgium and France. But just a few more words about what kind of a life he led. As I said, he was what we'd call a rich kid. He could do whatever he wanted. He loved traveling, and one of the things he did was he went off to Bayreuth, where Richard Wagner, the great opera composer, had constructed his own opera house, which is still there. And he went there and he heard the first performance, the world premiere of the opera Parsifal, which is one of the great operas by Wagner. He traveled to other places, and he was very cosmopolitan. He came back to Paris. He had his own place to live. I can just imagine what it looked like. It was a rich person's big apartment on one of the grand boulevards of Paris. And he would have what I guess they called soirées, which means evening parties, at which people like the painter Monet, the composer Debussy, there are all kinds of people in the arts would come there. Whether there was music there or just good conversation and good food, I'm not sure. But that was kind of the life that he led. So he began writing music, and he was a slow composer. He was always dissatisfied with what he was writing, always rewriting it, and didn't produce. He produced enough pieces. He wrote an opera, he wrote a symphony, he wrote some chamber music. But he was very, very interested in Franck and influenced by him, and then interested in his last decade in Belgium because of Ysaÿe, I think. Now, I should jump ahead and tell you that his life was short because of a tragedy. As a rich person, he had a country place he could go to. I don't know whether he owned it or it was in the family. And he loved riding his bicycle. And one day he was riding his bicycle down a hill too fast, crashed into a brick wall, and died instantly. He was only 44 years old. And the music from that very last decade of the 1890s, he was born in 1855, died not quite in the 20th century, 1899, is where the Belgian connection flowers. Belgium is a country that has two principal languages. One is called Flemish, which is virtually Dutch. Holland is the country just to the north of it, and the other is French. So you have these two national languages. And in the 1890s, in London, the great Irish-born English playwright George Bernard Shaw, as a young man, was not yet famous for all of the great plays that he wrote in his very long life, but also became a music critic. He was not really a musician, but he'd played the piano a little bit when he was young, and he got a job writing for one of the magazines there. And he wrote them with a nom de plume, a pen name, which was Corno di Bassetto, that basset horn. It was just a silly sounding name, but actually Mozart used that instrument, which is in the clarinet family, for some of his serenades. It's a longer instrument, somewhere between a clarinet and a bassoon. And in that music criticism, which was written roughly from 1890 to 1900, I have at home a collection of it was published much later when he was famous in 3 volumes of all of his critical reviews. And at one point, I went looking in those books. I couldn't find it, but it struck me as something very interesting. He was trying to talk about the music of Belgium and saying that it was kind of a very unusual mix of the 2 influences, of the German language, of the Dutch or whatever, the influence from Germany, and the interest of France. César Franck was living in Paris, but could be thought of as a mixture of those 2 cultures. And what Shaw was saying was coming with the complexity and the seriousness of German music and the lightness and the charm of French music. And he thought that it was a very unique mix, the Belgian music. So that's the background. And he decided to write this piece. We're talking now about Chausson, for a very unusual combination. He called it a concerto for violin, piano, and string quartet. And when you listen to the piece in this concert, you're going to hear something that would make it seem like a concerto, because there are a lot of places where just the piano and the violin are playing off of one another, and the strings are just sitting there. And then the strings come in and do what they're going to do. And it's kind of a little bit like a Baroque trio sonata where you have soloists in the band. And it goes through 4 movements, all quite different. The first movement starts with a 3-note ba, 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 very, very strong. And that becomes what I'd call a motive, but it's not really a theme, becomes the basis of the first theme area of the first movement. And it's very, very elaborate, very, very forceful, and very much elaborated, with some second theme, again, a little bit more relaxed. But you're going to find really places in the whole piece where it is the 2 of them alone, the 4 of them alone, all of them together. And it keeps its interest because he does it so well. The second movement is an absolutely French movement. It's called a Sicilienne. Sicilienne, you would say, is like Sicily, but actually when French composers write a Sicilienne, it's something like, if you think about Marie Antoinette, who played in the gardens of the palace there in something called the Petit Trianon, where she and her lady friends of the court pretended they were shepherdesses. And so it's a very lighthearted, very tuneful, gentle, breezy spring breeze. It's spring now. I hope the breezes are good. And it's an easy, light dance. That's after the very energized first movement. After that comes a slow movement, which is dark, brooding, sad, deep feeling, and which Chausson really digs very deep into the sad kind of serious emotions. And the whole thing is based upon, there is a bass line, there's da, ya, da, ya, da, da, 3 notes going down, 3 notes going up, that the whole first part of the movement, whatever happens above, there is always the bass underneath it, and that ties it together. And it's a beautiful movement. It's very touching. And after that, what do? You romp. So after that, he writes a last movement, très animé, a swirling, passionate, powerful, over-the-top finale that ends triumphantly. And there it is, and that's how we end our season. So enjoy the concert. Have a great summer. See you next year.